Welcome to the fifth industrial revolution. My name
Thank
is
you for inviting me to your project.
You're more than welcome, Dr. Buechner. And it's my pleasure today to have Dr. Buechner with us. As those of you who have already watched some of our podcasts, this project is really about exploring the intersection of human existence, space technology, and the future of planet Earth. As I said, my name is Rachin Kansal. I'm a professor at Seton Hall University. I also have 20 years in the healthcare industry, so very passionate about the topic of healthcare. And as we look at the state of the world, I see two trend lines that are happening in parallel. One trend line is the changing course of our planet Earth. As we look at planet Earth, and just in last 2 days, there were three key news items. One news item was that yesterday alone, enough ice on Greenland melted that would cover all of Florida under 2 inches of water. Another news story within last 2 days was Lake Powell has dried up enough that a lot of people have had to cancel houseboat and other boat reservations on the lake, and it is being closed by the National Park Service right now. The third article I read is that by end of this century, the wet temperature, which is the combination of temperature and humidity, will be so high in Southeast Asia, including India and Pakistan, that by end of the century, that area may not sustain life. That is 1/3 of world's population today. Even if half of this is true, the climate crisis and sustainability of planet Earth is in question. I also read somewhere that the core of planet Earth has the same temperature as sun, which is 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And as it begins to continue to either cool down or warm up, we will continue to see this, change in energy patterns and weather patterns on this heat ball that we live on. And, it will create a different cosmos that we live in. So that's one trend line. Planet Earth, it's changing, and a lot of effort to make it sustainable. Microclimates, etc., that are being created. The second trend line that we are seeing is just this trend line of space exploration, right? With the just in last 2 weeks, we have seen Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos go into space. We just heard the statistics in our last podcast that the cost of sending a kilo in space has gone down from $56,000 to about $2,500 and is rapidly decreasing. So we will be able to innovate in space at scale because the cost is going down. The third thing, and Dr. Buechner would know this more than I do, but edge computing is the next wave of technology. And edge computing can actually enable quite a bit of space exploration because it minimizes the time required for data to come from wherever we are in space to Earth, process it and send it back. That computation can happen there, and therefore, we can explore much faster. Wall Street is calling it the next trillion-dollar industry. So that's another trend line. The common theme I see in each of these, Earth not becoming sustainable as a place to live like it is today, and space exploration as human bodies are not adapt to any of those environments. So will health technology become the next, industrial revolution that enables us to adapt to life on planet Earth that's changed and in space? That's the thesis. And on this show, we have guests from multiple domains who talk about their points of view on this thesis. And today we really have the pleasure of inviting Dr. Buechner, who is a professor of philosophy at Rutgers University, to join our show. Dr. Buechner, what really attracted me to him is, one, he teaches critical thinking, and problems like these require critical thinking. So we are going to talk to him about the discipline of critical thinking and how to apply that to this topic. We also would talk to him about ethics, bioethics, and how to think of some of these issues from an ethical perspective. But before we do that, Dr. Buechner, welcome again on our show. And we would love for you to just tell the audience a little bit about yourself, your experiences, and introduce yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the introduction. I've done work in several areas in artificial intelligence. One is practical. I've done work on the problem of formally characterizing trust for digital agents. A breakthrough paper I wrote with Herman Devani, who is a well-known person in computer ethics, showed how to define a notion of trust for digital agents. And that, I think, is important work. We expanded on this work in several papers, and then we collaborated with Judith Simon, who is well known in Europe in philosophy of technology and artificial intelligence. She's now at the University of Hamburg. So I've got about 8 papers on the problem of trust.
Wonderful.
In fact, one of them I connect the problem of trust with a notion of ecological rationality that was developed by Gigerenzer. The old idea of rationality was tied to a notion of maximizing expected utility. And unfortunately, it doesn't work in practical situations because sometimes the calculations are just infeasible. But what people noticed is that in different environments, the notion of rationality can differ. And Gigerenzer was the person who noticed that. So I worked on developing a notion of trust that would apply to a notion that could be tied to a notion of ecological rationality. And then in another paper, I developed a notion of trust that could work with solving something called the frame problem, which to this day is considered the greatest problem in formalizing common sense reasoning in artificial intelligence. There are several frame problems, but the one that I'll spend just a minute or two talking about was created by John McCarthy and Patrick Hayes in the 1960s. And it's basically this. It sounds very simple. You're crossing a street. You notice a car coming down the street, and then you see that it's okay to cross. Very simple for human beings to do it. But how would you program a robot to cross the street? The problem is this. Things happen. Actions occur. Events occur. And these have consequences. So some things change and some things do not change. Now, how do you tell a robot, look only at the things that change and ignore the things that don't change? How do you tell a robot to do that without explicitly coding into the robot all of the things that change and all of the things that don't change, and having the robot check each one of them? If there are n objects and m properties, there are n times m things to check. So imagine a robot in a bookstore where a clerk picks up a pen. And there are 10,000 books on the shelves. None of the books change.
Right.
But the robot would have to check each one to make sure it hasn't changed. This is called the frame problem. And what I did was to show how a notion of trust was essential to, a formal notion of trust was essential to solving this. In the artificial intelligence literature, a new type of logic was created in the 1980s called non-monotonic logics. So AI divides into symbolic AI, which uses logic, and statistical AI, which is neural networks, connectionist AI. And many of the biggest advances have been in statistical AI. But unfortunately, statistical AI has many shortcomings. So Watson, IBM's fantastic program that defeated Ken Jennings on Jeopardy so many years ago, IBM thought they could retire and let Watson make all their money for them.
Right.
But it turns out Watson is very good at one very specific kind of thing. But one person said, Watson basically has the intelligence of a third grader.
You know, and this could be good news that right now technology is still not very advanced and we can control it. So let's come back into the relationship of humans and technology in a minute, if it's okay. I want to start to also talk to you about your work on critical thinking and how we can really apply that discipline to think of the problem that we have put forward. So let me start by asking you a simple question. How do you define critical thinking?
Excellent question, and a very important question. I think one of the most important questions you can ask in education. I have a narrow view of critical thinking, which is basically it's the study of arguments and how they work. Arguments are probably the most important vehicle humans have created for discovering how the world works and transmitting our knowledge about how the world works to other people. We do it via arguments. So science uses arguments, economics uses arguments, everyday people use arguments.
Right.
Now they have a very simple structure. You make some claim about the world, that's the conclusion of the argument, and you provide evidence, information in support of that claim. They're the premises of the argument.
Right.
So a simple structure. You can make it complex because you can argue for a premise within an argument, so they can get arbitrarily complex.
Right.
But that's the basic structure of an argument. However, that says nothing about when it is rational for you to believe that the claim the argument makes is true.
Yep.
Now, here's a simple answer. If there's enough evidence in the premises to support the claim, then it's rational to believe the claim is true. But now the question becomes, how do you know how much evidence there is? How do you measure it?
Right.
And now I'll tell you a sad story. If you look at critical thinking textbooks, none of them can answer that question. They say the following: if there's probabilistic information in your premises, then you can determine how well it supports the claim. And this is what happens in science. But how many arguments has a typical viewer of this program seen in newspapers with probabilistic information in them? None.
Yeah.
None. So how do you do it then if you only have qualitative descriptions, qualitatively expressed information in your premises?
Yeah.
So, in fact, one Princeton philosopher said this is the greatest outstanding problem in philosophy: how to determine in non-probabilistic terms how well the premises of an argument support the claim that's made. I will say that I've made a stab at this, and it will be in a book that will be published soon by World Scientific Press.
Wonderful. Congrats.
I have discovered how to, and I've proved this, how to show that the qualitative information expressed in the premises of an argument approximately correlates with probabilities. You don't have to have probabilities at all. You can simply, and now when I say simply, I'll have to say something about some ideas that people have had about how to determine argument support. Now, the basic idea is that if an argument is valid, then it is impossible for the conclusion to be false when the premises are true. You have perfect support. It's impossible to imagine a situation in which the premises are true and the conclusion is false. So when an argument is not valid, when there is a deficiency in the information expressed in the premises of the argument, then you can reveal that deficiency by imagining a situation in which the premises are true and the conclusion false. And this is called a counterexample to the argument. Now, that's not my idea. Everyone knows about counterexamples, but no one knew how to create a counterexample support scale that measures the extent to which you move down the scale as you find more and more counterexamples. And what I did was to show that the counterexample scale approximately correlates with a probabilistic scale. But I'm not going to explain to your viewers how that's done. It would take too much time. But this, I think, if it in fact pans out, will be very important.
Good.
If I were bragging, I would say the following. This could create an industrial revolution in education. Wonderful. Because people, students, teachers do not know how to determine how well premises support a claim. So if we had an answer to that, we could then say when it's rational to believe the claim is true, when one argument is better than another argument, when to reject an argument, when to hold on to an argument. Now you can't do any of those things. You can talk about it, but you don't have any criteria that allow you to actually do it. And the criterion is a support scale for arguments whose premises express information purely qualitatively and not quantitatively.
So let me try to repeat what you just said in layman's understanding, which is my understanding right now. So at the very highest level, you define critical thinking as an argument with supporting premises.
The study of arguments and argumentation.
And argumentation, right? And you also talked about that the premises may or may not be correct, but an argument is solid when the premises are correct, and then the conclusion is right. So now let me apply your definition of critical thinking to the three arguments I made, right? So the first argument I made is Earth is becoming less sustainable for human life, and I gave some examples, right? High-level examples. I said space exploration is going to happen, and I gave some examples as to what's happening and as to why. And I made a third argument, which is health technology is going to be the next industrial revolution, because to survive in space and to survive in a changed planet Earth, we will have to adapt our bodies to do that. So from a critical thinking perspective, and as a practitioner of critical thinking, how would you either critique those arguments or say, yep, sounds right, but do X, Y, and Z, or frame it this way so that you can think of it more appropriately?
Yeah. Well, prior to evaluating an argument, you actually have to create the argument. So if your question is, what will be the fifth industrial revolution? Then you have to think, well, what might it be?
Yeah.
Then if you propose what it might be, you can argue that, in fact, it will be that. Now, there are actually two questions concerning the fifth industrial revolution. One is, what will it be? The second is, what ought it to be? And there are two distinct questions.
Yeah.
And the type of arguments in which they occur are quite different. The one makes a descriptive claim about what it will be.
Yeah.
The other makes a normative claim about what it ought to be.
Yeah.
To tell your viewers what I think it ought to be, I think it ought to be involved with climate, because we are facing a crisis, as you noted earlier, a big crisis. Here's something I'm scared about. 50% of all organic matter on Earth is phytoplankton. And phytoplankton is responsible for 70% of oxygen on Earth.
Yeah.
If we destroy the seas, we'll be gone.
Yeah.
all organic life on Earth will cease. That's to say, all life that needs oxygen.
Yeah.
The only things that will survive are viruses and anaerobic bacteria.
Yeah.
So that's my reason for thinking that that's what the next revolution ought to be. Well, what will it be? Here's a way of massaging your brain, very simple way, into thinking about what it might be. Just ask yourself to imagine, ask any person, following question. What do you think things will be like 30 years from now?
Yeah.
What new technologies will we see?
Yeah.
And those answers will be helpful in giving a sense of the terrain concerning what things technology will move toward. Certainly, medicine is very important. I myself am quite grateful for the current state of technology. 10 months ago, I was diagnosed with blockages in my vertebral arteries in the back of my neck. Being a jogger my entire life, I never thought I would have a problem. But in fact, jogging does not make you immune because heredity can also play a role.
Yeah.
So a neurovascular doctor performed a procedure. I was awake the entire time, inserted a catheter with a camera at the tip the size of a grain of salt.
Yeah.
And instruments, micro instruments at the tip, so they could compress the plaque and insert a stent. I was told this technology was not available 5 years ago.
It was not.
And so 5 years ago, I would have been told, you have to live with this. And what was happening is that the vertebral arteries supplied blood to the basilar artery, which goes to the cerebellum. And if it doesn't get enough blood, you pass out.
Right.
So I was passing out several times last year.
I'm so sorry to hear that.
And last October, I had this procedure. So I think that, and seeing people in the hospital with different illnesses, and talking with people about what their medical problems are, there'll be a need for developing medical technology. Now, whether it'll be a revolution or not, I was unclear about what is meant by industrial revolution. So I went to the best place, the dictionary.
Yes.
And the American Heritage Dictionary says the following. And this is something probably most people don't know, because we tend to talk about the industries as what the revolution is about. But in fact, that's not the case at all. The revolution is about the socioeconomic effects of automating industry. So it's not the specific industry, it's the automation of a specific industry. And it's not the automation, that's the revolution. The revolution are the socioeconomic effects. So in fact, many people simply take the revolution to be what new industry will be developed. And I think that that's a sensible, common sense way of thinking about it. But we are not following the necessary and sufficient conditions supplied by the American Heritage Dictionary. I'm not sure about space. Certainly, the fact that there are planets that have enormous wealth in the form of minerals and other things is a reason for space taking off at some point. It depends on what happens here, though.
Yes.
For instance, what should we do about fossil fuels? Which right now are the most important form of energy. That's creating climate problems. And so a new form of technology At Rutgers Newark, there are people in the chemistry department working on alternative forms of energy,
Yeah.
creating solar cells, nano solar cells.
Yes.
None of this has panned out yet, but we're waiting for the big breakthrough. If it ever pans out, then there'll be two issues: how to get the technology up and running, and the political, social issue of how to shut down the fossil fuels.
Yeah.
And that's not going to be an easy job. Okay. There are many, many difficulties. So you need people to think not just about the technology, but about the social and political issues as well. So we need everyone on board when we do these sorts of things. You just don't need the technologists. You need other people as well. And so it's very important. And the nice thing is that it creates job opportunities for people in other fields: economics, politics, sociology, and even in literature, in artificial intelligence.
Yes.
There's now a program at MIT. They're pumping millions and millions of dollars. In fact, the figure I heard was $1 billion into a program that melds the humanities with artificial intelligence.
Which is very important. Yeah, I mean, you have to do that. And it would have taken only a professor on our show to educate us on the Industrial Revolution definition. But, that really is a good way to think about it, that it's not the technology which is the revolution, but it's the society and the societal changes that are the revolution. And we seem to be on the precipice now with these big trend lines that may shape the next, shape of our society. But you started to talk about AI and you started to talk about technology quite a bit. And I want to come back to that for a second, right? So do you see AI creating a new society?
Very interesting question. Yes, we see it already with Facebook and other forms of social media. And that's the big problem, that hopefully one way of addressing it is to have universal critical thinking courses, that's to say, taught everywhere. And until people have a way of showing how well premises support a claim, critical thinking will still be on the back burner. Because the most important question is not what the structure of the argument is, but how it works. Does it work? Is it rational for me to believe the claim the argument makes? And if you don't have a way of telling how to do that, then you don't have anything. You can't say when someone's won an argument or when someone's lost an argument. You can't say anything. And so it's just a matter of people yelling at one another, and the loudest voice wins. And that's not a way for society to be. That's the way it is on Facebook right now, unfortunately. The people who have the biggest and jazziest platforms can say much more, and something has to be done. How do you get critical thinking into Facebook? That's an important question. The other question, the big one, there are people, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, the late Stephen Hawking, Nick Bostrom, a philosopher at Oxford. They have said the greatest problem facing humanity is the rise of superintelligent AI.
Yeah.
A superintelligent AI, first of all, can recursively learn more and more and learn how to become better thinkers.
Right.
And Hawking said at some point it'll be inevitable that they'll simply see us as annoyances and decide to get rid of us.
Yeah.
Now, here's what's interesting about that. None of those thinkers have said anything about whether it is possible for robots, for AI, to have beliefs, desires, motivations to have a psychology. There's a famous philosopher at Berkeley. He's now almost 90 and he's been retired for many years, John Searle. And his view was the following: whether AI can have beliefs, desires, and motivations is a matter of the metaphysics of computation. That means, what's the nature of a computation? And his view was that computations are observer relative, they're subjective. If there were no human beings, there would be no computations. His view is that they are not intrinsic properties of the physics that are discovered by science. They are instead assigned to the physics by human observers. They're purely subjective, observer relative properties. And thus, any AI cannot, in Searle's view, by the nature of computation, cannot have beliefs, desires, motivations, cannot have a real psychology.
I see.
If Searle is right, that's a tremendous relief. There could never be, even if AI becomes super intelligent, they could never have beliefs or desires of the following form: human beings are annoyances, I have the desire to get rid of them. That's not to say humans couldn't program AI to exterminate other humans.
Yeah.
We humans are very good at
we thrive on killing other humans.
Right. But that's not the problem that Hawking, Musk, Gates, and Bostrom are worried about. The problem is AI, autonomous AI, without any help from human beings, deciding to get rid of us. And they think that that's the greatest problem we face in the future.
So if climate, yes, sorry, go ahead.
Let me just finish my thought. What's interesting is that the greatest problem in these people's eyes facing us in the future is held hostage to philosophy and the nature of the computation. No computer scientist worries about the metaphysics of computation. They have models, formal models of computation. And in fact, the Turing machine that goes back to Alan Turing in the 1930s is the most common model of a computation, and it's taught in all elementary courses in computation. But no computer scientist worries about the nature of a computation. Only philosophers worry. And to this day, there's no answer. Here's some bad news. I wrote a book that was published by the MIT Press in 2008. And in one chapter, I addressed Searle's criticism and showed that his view of the metaphysics of computation is contradictory and falls to pieces. That's not to say I wish
it happens.
I'm glad Searle is wrong. I hope he's not wrong. I hope there's something wrong with my argument. I hope, in fact, AI cannot have beliefs and desires. But at any rate, it's an open question in philosophy about the nature of computations, whether AI can have beliefs and desires and motivations. And thus, the greatest problem in these persons' eyes facing we human beings is a matter of philosophy. Now, if philosophy shows that they can have beliefs and desires, then the next question is, where do we go from there?
Yes.
And that's what Gates and Musk and Hawking and Bostrom are addressing. Where do we go right now? What do we do? By the way, this problem was thought about in the 1950s by the science fiction writer Isaac Asimov.
Yes.
And he formulated Asimov's 3 laws of robotics. And he claimed that if you program these 3 laws into a robot, they could not kill. If you look at the laws, it's almost a trivial game. I used to have my students do this. You can game the system, and you can show that in satisfying the three laws, a robot could exterminate every human being on planet Earth. So what this shows is that it would be very difficult to formulate laws that you would program into a robot such that it would conform to those laws and hopefully never exterminate human beings. Be incredibly difficult to do this.
Yeah, I mean, someone may see a lot of economic gain in it, and that may wipe out the entire humanity. But what you raise is a very interesting scenario, which is technology becomes autonomously intelligent and sensitive, and therefore it decides to eradicate humanity. And in that case, it won't matter whether Earth is sustainable or space exploration is required, because at that time humans don't exist, and then technology rules.
Yes.
But let's hope for the other scenario where technology doesn't become so powerful. And so this brings me to the ethics question, right? The ethics of AI, ethics of technology, ethics of medical technology included there. So what is your view on the ethics of programming these new technologies? Should we program them to become adjuncts to help us do our jobs? Where is that ethical line which says this is what we should allow medical technology, artificial intelligence, other technologies to do, and this is what we should not? And how do you really keep people close to that ethical line?
These are fascinating questions. Everyone wants to improve their body in some way or another, and their mind in some way or another. It's almost this is almost a universal truth.
Yeah.
And this creates problems. Namely, suppose we develop a technology that enables us to increase our intelligence by, if you measure in terms of IQ,
even 10%.
By 100 points.
Yeah.
So you go into the 200 range.
Yeah.
And suppose that this technology costs quite a bit of money.
Yeah.
Suppose it costs $1 million to implement it in a particular human being. That raises the question, is this socially just? Is it okay for people who have $1 million to spend it on their kids? These are very difficult ethical questions. We're seeing right now questions with vaccinations with COVID. For instance, if someone refuses to be vaccinated, but has a medical condition, is a doctor morally required to treat that person? This actually was a question that was sent to Anthony Appiah, who is a well-known philosopher who has for several years written an ethics column in the New York Times magazine every Sunday. And if I urge all of your viewers to get the Sunday Times just to read Appiah's ethics column in the Sunday magazine.
Okay.
It's rewarding. Very interesting questions. By the way, how did he answer this question? He said, when you take the Hippocratic Oath, you are obligated
to do that,
to treat anyone who's ill, no matter what beliefs they have, no matter what they've done. It could be the worst criminal in the world, and you are obligated, because the Hippocratic Oath says nothing about the person other than they have some medical condition that needs to be treated, and you are morally required to treat that condition. But these questions about when you extend beyond normalcy, no one would question if you're ill to be given some medical technology to make you better. It's when you're normal and you want to go above normal, then these questions arise. And so these force us to ask very hard questions. First of all, what is normal in medical technology? You get very interesting problems when you consider not just the physiology of the body, but the psychology of the body.
The mind,
and that's part of medicine now.
Yeah.
Certainly, mental health is a substantial part of medical health.
A big part.
And mental health raises questions about normality. When is a mental state normal and when not? And that's a very hard question to answer. And until you have an answer to it, it's very difficult to say when you are restoring someone's mental health versus when you are improving it and going beyond what's normal. And so we need to answer questions about normality with mental health. But we still need to address the ethical question: when is it okay to improve someone's condition? We'd all love to see what it would be like for someone to shoot a round of golf where they got holes in one on each hole. A round of golf of, say, 20 or 19. I mean, so far, the lowest round of golf I've heard of is in the high 50s.
50s, yes.
Extraordinary. But imagine developing a technology where you create a certain coordination and a certain ability of the brain to perceive distance and coordinate all the muscles in such a way that they could practically pinpoint the position of the ball when they hit it with a club. People would love to see something like that. How long would it last, however? It might just be a spur of the moment thing, and then you'd get bored with it after a while, and then you'd say, oh, these freaks, we don't want to see them any longer.
Right.
These are hard questions, and it's not just a matter of ethics. It's a matter of the way in which we live our lives. We live our lives in certain ways. There's a famous philosopher whose name was Ludwig Wittgenstein, and he said we live in different forms of life. And in different forms of life, we have different understandings of how things work. And this is certainly true when we talk about things that human beings do. So we need to think carefully about what it is we do. And these are questions that can't be answered by ethics, because ethics doesn't address the nature of the things that we do, how we see what we do. People in different forms of life see things in different ways.
In different ways,
I move my hand like this, and in one culture, I'm doing something completely different from what someone in another culture sees me doing. Ethics can't address that. And this is the problem for enhancements in medical technology. With the enhancements result in different kinds of behaviors, and these behaviors will be viewed differently in different cultures. And so the question is, how do we address these differences in behavior in different cultures in such a way that there's some uniform ethical approach to all of them?
You raised some very, very good issues here. You raised the issue of what's normal and looking at ethics in the context of what's normal. So, okay to invest in technology that helps you be normal, but may not be okay to invest in technology that gives you superiority because you have wealth, right? So that's a good way of framing the ethics question. The other thing that you really said was ethics says not the action itself, ethics says the judgment of that action based on different lenses.
Well, yes, intention is a very important role in ethics,
Yes.
and in the law as well. both legally and morally, intention plays a great role in making decisions about whether someone has acted morally or not. And there too, in the law, it's known that it can be very difficult to establish what someone's intention is in performing an action.
Yeah. So I'm going to make an argument based on what you've just said and based on everything that we have heard so far. And I can tell you, I mean, this is so interesting, just getting a philosopher's point of view on this. But I'll now make an argument, and then I'll transition it to Anthony and Tillman, two of my students, to see if they have questions. So the argument I will make is that because life on planet Earth will continue to become unsustainable in the way we know it today, and because of resource constraints, we may go into space to find those resources that we can't find on planet Earth. The new normal will require us to enhance our bodies from what they can do today to what they will need to do to adapt to those environments. So ethically, it will be okay for medical technology to allow us to do that.
Certainly, if we make changes to our bodies in order to adapt to living on other planets, these are things right now we can't conceive of what those changes would be like. There is a very, when I was a kid, there was a science fiction show on television called The Outer Limits. And the very first episode was one in which a group of government agents, in order to prevent future wars, decided to transform a human being into a monster.
Yes.
The monster would then go up in a spaceship, just into the upper atmosphere, and then land. And the view was that all the nations would get together and in face of this threat. Unfortunately, it did not work out. But what was fascinating was the person whose body changed in order to look like a monster. And this is an issue that arises when we think about the types of changes, physiological changes that might have to be made in order for someone to survive on another planet. Myself, my personal view is I hope it never comes to that, where planet Earth becomes uninhabitable because the climate is so bad and we have to then move to other planets. But there still will be people. There may be incredible riches on other planets that people think are worth mining. And so that will happen. We can't stop that from happening. And then the question will be, if the technology allows us to change the structure, the physiological structure of a human being, are there limits to what we will allow? Do we transgress something? Now, I don't know. The problem here is that it's too easy to bring in the notion of God created us in a certain way.
Yes.
And therefore, any difference is not good. That was, in fact, one argument against vaccinations a couple of 100 years ago.
Even today.
And some people hold that argument today. I don't see that as a good argument, but there's still a worry. Can human beings become so strange that we no longer consider them to be human beings? And this is now a philosophical question, in addition to an ethical question. That's to say, what is the nature of a human being? If we master here's another possibility for the next industrial revolution. We master the genetic code. We learn the language, the programming language. We already have tremendous knowledge about the human genome, but we don't know the code. We don't know how to program yet.
Not yet.
We do know how to make changes. And CRISPR is one of the most amazing technological devices. But suppose that we can make any change, we can change the code. At what point are we no longer talking about a human being? And if we no longer have a human being because we've altered the genetic code to such an extent that the essential features of a human being are lost, then what do we say? That's
Yeah,
the
so this,
question.
yeah, so as you're saying this, I'm thinking of our dear friend Darwin, and I'm watching the time. We only have a couple more minutes, so I'll make this comment and then we'll wrap up. But I'm thinking of Darwin's theory of evolution, right? And so I'm thinking of the apes before they became humans. And imagine apes thinking of all of these questions, ethical, philosophical questions, and saying, we always want to remain apes and we never want to be humans. But at one point they became humans, right? But humans, by the very fact that we have been given a brain that can think, are impatient creatures. And so we will use CRISPR, we will use other technologies to advance our evolution, right? So I actually subscribe to the view that we as humans that exist today are not going to be the humans that exist 200, 300, 400 years from now. We will look very different, act very different, and then we'll have many more superpowers just because we will not allow Darwin to evolve us. We will use our own power of technology to evolve us, and so we will be different. That we can't escape. Now, what we do with that, it becomes really interesting, and I know I won't be alive to see that. But if I were to put a line in the sand, I would say humans will look very different within 100 years than apes looked over a million years.
I like the way you thought about that. Apes would not be able to think what it would be like to no longer be an ape.
Yeah, exactly.
But it's an amazing thing about human thought and consciousness.
Exactly.
We can have these thoughts.
Yes.
And the one thing that wouldn't change, although the human physiology might no longer, or the physiology might no longer be that of a human being, still from the inside, the qualitative feel of experiences would be the same.
The six senses
would be the same. It wouldn't change. Consciousness would not change, even though the physiology changes radically. And so from the inside, it would still feel
the same.
Like the same. But from the outside, things might be quite different. And if we don't know what things will be like 200 years from now. We may have to do that. There may be a need. There may be way, in order to continue life on this planet, if environmental conditions get worse, who knows how we might have to change our bodies so that
we may need gills, not lungs. Yeah.
Right. So we can withstand extreme environmental conditions.
Yeah.
But still from the inside, it'll feel the same.
Wonderful. No, that's actually a very good positive note to end today's discussion on, that as human consciousness goes, we will maintain it. And if technology doesn't take us over and wipe us, there is hope that we will maintain human consciousness, our senses, and continue to be human at a very, very fundamental, manner, despite the changes we may make to our physiological experience.
Yes.
So thank you so much for that, Dr. Buechner. I know we are out of time today, so Anthony, my apologies.
Before I go, can I plug one book on technology?
Absolutely.
I wrote a long critical review of a book by Wendell Wallach, who's a philosopher of technology at Yale. And he wrote a book 3 years ago called A Dangerous Master, how to keep technology from slipping beyond our control. It is a brilliant book. And anyone interested in technology, anyone interested in how technology will affect us in the future, ought to read this book. It is a brilliant, brilliant book. So that's my recommendation. I want to plug this man's book.
Yeah, yeah. No, we will, we'll certainly buy that and read that book. Yes, I mean the battle of whether humans can control technology or will technology one day. Hopefully, for the next 100 years, it remains humans control it.
Yes,
Hopefully
yeah,
longer. So
yes.
let's hope that. And with that, thank you so much, Dr. Buchner.
Thank you. Thank you for
It
inviting
was a
me
great
to
pleasure.
participate.
Yeah, and then you really made so many things very, very clear in terms of how we can think about this from a critical thinking perspective, from ethics perspective, from philosophy perspective. So truly appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.
It's a pleasure.
Thanks so
It's a
much.
pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much for coming, Dr. Buechner.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Second that. Thank you again.
All right. Wonderful. So that was a great conversation with Dr. Buechner. A lot of thoughts there and a lot of questions to noodle on as we think about this topic. So question number one, or the first topic to noodle upon really is about critical thinking, right? So he gave a very easy definition of critical thinking. It is an argument and supporting premises, and the more right the premises are, the more supportable the premises are, the more supportable the argument is. And critical thinking wise, always strive for that, making an argument and then making sure that the premises support that. The other thing he talked about within that context is this whole idea of descriptive versus normative, right? So you can always make an argument which is descriptive, which is X will look like Y in the future, or normative, it ought to look like X in the future. So both of those are good ideas of arguments and then premises that support it. And that's how you really, advance critical thinking. Number two, he talked a lot about this correlation between technology and human beings and a hope that technology will never become or never gain the human consciousness. And that may be the only way of us controlling technology and technology not wiping us out. Again, a very, very interesting topic. Will technology ever gain human consciousness? So let's think about that. Number three, he talked about ethics, and he talked about ethics in terms of advancing technology to make humans normal and using technology to make humans supernormal. And maybe it's ethical when we are using technology to make humans normal, not ethical when we are trying to gain an advantage by making us supernormal. Now, the definition of normal may change over time, and we will see that. But again, a third key takeaway in terms of when we think of ethics as the outcome it drives. So again, a very, very interesting episode. Thank you again to Dr. Buechner, who was with us, and we will see you again shortly. Goodbye.